Welcome to this week's episode of Biz Success in 15, where top experts share hot tips and strategies that you can implement in as little as 15 minutes to build your dream business. And now here's your host, the Visibility Whiz, Cindy J.
Hi, I'm Cindy J, the Visibility Whiz, and welcome to this episode of Biz Success in 15, where top experts share hot tips and strategies that you can implement in 15 minutes or less to build your business. Today, our guest is Erik K. Johnson, and he's the premier coach focused on the art of podcasting. He's been near the top of the radio rating since 2000, and he's also coached many others to do the same thing with even greater success. Erik's a nationally recognized talent coach, an on-air personality, and a radio program director. Welcome, Erik. It's a pleasure to have you.
Cindy, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
So excited to talk about podcasting. It's, to me, such an interesting subject, and I know a lot of people want to start podcasts and really don't know how, or they wonder if it's the right fit for them. So this will be a fun conversation.
I'm looking forward to it.
But first, can you share with us a personal or business challenge that you had to overcome in order to achieve your level of success?
Well, there's really been two big challenges for me in the past. The first, when I was first getting into radio, I had to overcome that imposter syndrome because when I was getting into radio, I was actually getting a degree in architecture. And kind of fell into radio by accident and then ended up being on the radio station in a full-time capacity without any formal training. And all of these guys that were on the radio station had been in radio for years. They had gone and received college education in it. And so here I am, like playing dress up, like pretending I knew what I was doing. And the imposter syndrome really kicked in big time. And you know, that little voice in my head saying, you know, who are you to think that you can do this? I had to fight that back hard. And it took me quite a few years until I realized I knew what I was doing. And not only that, had confidence in what I was doing. Mm-hmm. So it took a while, took a lot of learning, but I finally overcame that. And then, 25 years into radio, podcasting came along and I really started falling in love with podcasting and just the freedom that you have in being able to create a show like a podcast. You have complete creative control, which is phenomenal. But all of a sudden, the fear of the tech started jumping in. And because I didn't know how to podcast, I didn't know what an RSS feed was. I didn't know how to put ID3 tags in an MP3. I didn't even know how to create an MP3. And so all of a sudden the whole imposter syndrome kind of kicked in again with the fear of the tech. But once I got into it, I realized that the technical side of it isn't really that scary. I mean, if you can upload a video to YouTube or to your Facebook page, you could pretty much create a podcast. It's pretty easy once you kind of peel back the onion and realize what's behind the curtain. You're off and running. So
I completely agree with you. A lot of it, the software is so user friendly today, and I'm sure whenever you started, it wasn't as user friendly as it is today. But now it's like, you know, if you can read and click a button, pretty much you can get it through the techie part.
Oh yeah, and the software and the tech changes every 12 to 18 months, and it becomes even easier than it was before. And it's so easy to create a podcast today.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I love that you shared like the imposter syndrome, and even that it took you a couple years to get confidence. One of my favorite things is, and I say it all the time, is people always think, I have to be confident before I do something. But confidence is never a place you arrive. It's a place of being. And the only way to be confident at anything is by doing it. And so you step through your fears by going to work every day and doing your radio show, and that's the only reason you became confident. Had you waited to be confident, you never would have arrived there.
I completely agree. You know, the opposite of fear isn't courage. The opposite of fear is the acceptance of that fear and being able to walk through it anyway. To embrace that fear. We all have some imposter syndrome. If you don't have a little bit of that self-doubt, you're not pushing yourself hard enough. You're not trying enough new things.
Right. Yes. And I know even, I forget who said, Roosevelt, I think, who said we have nothing to fear but fear itself.
Indeed.
And if you let the fear control you, you're never going to achieve anything.
Exactly. You have to embrace the fear, because if you think what's the worst that could possibly happen and then do it anyway, that you'll learn to overcome fear. I get on stage or step out in front of a crowd. I'll go in radio. I'll go introduce a concert. So I'll walk out on stage where there's 15,000 people in the arena waiting for the show to start, and I'll welcome everybody to the arena, to the show, thank them for listening to the radio station. And, here comes the star. Thanks for coming out. And people always are boggled. Their minds are blown of how I can get on stage in front of 15,000 people. And, I just think, what's the worst that could possibly happen? I could get out there and stumble on my words or anything, but tomorrow nobody's going to remember that anyway. They're only going to remember that I was on stage in front of them for 90 seconds and welcome them to the show. And after you do it for, a handful of times, the confidence comes.
And even talking about fears with podcasting, I would assume that one of the fears some people have, besides the techie thing, is their voice. I mean, you have a great voice. You have that radio announcer voice, probably because of your years of experience. But
Yes.
You have it, and you don't seem, to me anyways, to like stutter over your words. Like a lot of times I still stutter over my words. And I always say with my voice, my mother was from New York, my father was from the South, so I was a very confused child and have this intermixture of both verbiages.
Yeah.
But I've heard other people talk about it, that they have a lisp, or they're afraid of their voice. They don't want to say those ums or their ands, or they just don't think their voice is good enough. So if somebody feels like that and they want to start a podcast, or even just be a guest on a podcast, what advice do you have for them?
I did an entire episode of Podcast Talent Coach just talking about the voice, because so many people reach out to me and say, I want to start a podcast, but I hate my voice. Mm-hmm. And the first thing I tell everybody is we all hate our voice, because your voice sounds so different when you listen to a recording of it than it does in your head, because of the physiology of your head. When you talk in a normal voice, the bones inside of your head vibrate. And so you get a different sound. And when you listen to your voice through a recording, you're missing that vibration of your head, of your jaw, of your skull. And so your voice sounds different recorded than it does in your head when you're speaking, because of that physiology. So we all hate our voice because it's just different. But your voice doesn't sound any worse than anybody else's voice, and you'll get over it. And if you ask 9 people are going to say your voice sounds fine, because because they're used to listening to it. And so there are things you can do to make your voice sound stronger. First, try and speak from your diaphragm, from down, below your lungs, rather than speaking up in your throat. That'll drop your voice down a little bit. And you won't have to work as hard to talk, and your voice won't get as tired as quickly. And if you stand up, it opens your airway as well, and it makes it much easier to speak, and makes your voice have a warmer quality to it. So those are a few things that you can do. Avoid caffeine, avoid really syrupy drinks. When you drink water, drink room temperature water. That'll help protect your voice. And to avoid stuttering over a lot of your words, 2 things you can do. 1, speak about a step slower than you normally speak. That'll give your mind time to keep up with you. And the second thing you can do is don't be afraid of the pregnant pause. When there's silence in the room, that's okay. People want to fill the silence with every or It's okay to just let the words stop and hang there a minute. The best thing about silence, it attracts attention. Because when it's a constant flow of words, your mind just kind of glazes over. But when the words stop and there's that pause right there, your ears perk up because there's silence. And so a pregnant pause can be a very powerful thing in speech.
Very, very good tips. Thank you for sharing those. And also, as far as your voice and talking, I know that storytelling, or you say the storytelling, the secret sauce of podcasting. So Indeed. How does one tell a story during the podcast, and why is storytelling so important?
First of all, storytelling is important because that's how we create friendships. Think about your best friend. You know everything about that person. Is it because you've been there for everything, or is it simply because they tell you everything? They tell you the stories that have happened in their life. You know about their childhood because they've told you everything about their childhood, even though you weren't there living through it with them. Friendships and the stories that we tell reveal things about ourselves. We through our stories, we reveal what we value. We reveal what we believe. We reveal things about ourselves through the stories we decide to share with our friends and with those that are close to us. So by the stories that you tell, people get to know who you are, and they get to decide whether or not they like you, and then they get to decide whether or not they trust you because you're trusting them with the information that you're sharing within your stories. The trick to telling a story is to lead with the punchline. You want to lead with the headline. You want to tell people where the story is going before you start droning on and on and on about the story. If I just wander into a story about this past weekend, I was hanging out with my friends. You know, it was just me and like two of the guys. It was like Saturday, and they had come over to the house because they weren't doing anything. You know, you're going to start going, where is this story going? Like, what's the point of this? Because I didn't lead with the headline. If I started with you know what, this past weekend, I think I found something in the attic that might be worth $300,000. It was crazy. You see, it was Saturday, and two of my friends had come over because they hadn't done anything. It was just a normal Saturday, and we were hanging out. And now I get into the details of the story. You know where we're going, because at the end of this story, I'm going to find something that might be worth $300,000.
Right.
So the trick to telling a story is to lead with the headline.
Mm-hmm. I learned that in Toastmasters. Toastmasters helped me a lot, I think, with speaking, and also the art of storytelling, because I always wanted to do everything chronologically.
Yeah. The dazzling details within the story really make it come to life.
Mm-hmm.
You want to paint that picture in the theater of the mind of your listener. Really put them in the moment where they can feel and smell and taste what's going on.
Right. And next, because podcasting is important and somebody can really use it to build their brand and to build their business. So how is a podcast used to do that?
We talk about this a lot on the podcast, on Podcast Talent Coach. It's how we take our podcast and use it to grow our business, to use it to build our authority. And we do that by the stories that we tell in there. If you think about it, people do business with those that they know, like, and trust. A lot of people who teach business and teach branding talk about that a lot. Well, what better way to get your tribe to get to know you and like you and trust you than by spending a half hour with you every week, or 45 minutes, or however long you decide to create a podcast. Imagine spending that 30 minutes with your tribe every week, telling them about the things you believe and that you love and that you're passionate about, and what you love to help them do. Your podcast is a perfect example. You come on the podcast, you talk about visibility, because that's the thing that you're passionate about. It's like, how do we get visible on the internet? How do we take our business and really get it in front of people? And your love for that topic comes through the speakers, and that's how you make that connection with your audience. And there's no better way to do that than with a podcast. Video, people think, well, video is much more powerful than audio. I completely disagree, because if you and I are watching a video, we're seeing the exact same images and we're interpreting the video in the exact same way. If you and I see a red automobile in a video, you and I see the exact same red automobile. Mm-hmm. But if you're hearing about a red automobile in an audio form, you're envisioning the perfect red automobile for you.
I'm a red 65 Mustang.
See? Well, you know what, Cindy? I think we're on the same page then, because mine was a 67 red Mustang. But we're pretty close. But who doesn't love a cherry red Mustang? But where it is, what it looks like, is it moving? Is it parked? What's the interior look like? Is it a rag top? Is the rag top up or down? Is it a hard top? Does it have a chrome wheels? Is it out on the desert? Is it on the highway? Is it parked in your driveway? whatever's perfect for you, that's how you envision it in your theater of the mind.
Right.
If we're watching a video of it, we see it the exact same way. So audio, especially a podcast, can be so powerful when it comes to developing your brand and explaining to your audience what you're all about.
I absolutely love it. And I was really intrigued whenever I seen this question on your speaker sheet, so I had to ask it. How can somebody improve their podcast in 1 week?
How can you improve your podcast in 1 week? The first thing you can do is adequate show prep. I mean, when you prepare for your show, you have to know where your show is going. There has to be a purpose for the show. If today you're bringing a guest on, why do you have the guest on? What is it that your audience is going to get out of this particular episode? And how are they going to be better and transformed by the end of the show? That has to be part of the prep before you hit record. You have to know where you're going, how you hope to help your audience, and what you hope to help them do. Just by doing that, your content can be so much stronger just on this particular episode. If you go through a few of the other things, I have a whole bunch of worksheets on my website that you can go get access to at no cost, but they'll walk you through various things. And one of the things when I critique podcasters and I help them improve their content, we talk about their call to action. And when I get to the end of the episode, so many people have, hey, thanks for listening. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast and go leave me a review on iTunes and shoot me an email if you have any questions, and head over to the website and make sure you sign up for my lead magnet. And by the way, I have a book out, and don't forget about that. And next week, and follow me on Facebook, and here's my Twitter handle, and on Instagram. And I'm like, oh, I can't follow. What? Stop. Just stop. I don't need 17 calls to action, because you run into the decision paradox. Where, have you ever been driving down the street and you see a pothole coming right at you, and you're like, oh no, here comes a pothole, and you freeze and you run right into it, right? And it shakes your whole car, and you're thinking, man, I could have moved a little to the right or a little to the left, and I could have missed the pothole completely, but instead I ran right into it. Why is that? Well, because you couldn't make the decision. You ran into the decision paradox because you didn't want to make the wrong decision, so you made no decision. If I go a little bit to the right, I might hit the curb. If I go a little bit to the left, I might get in the other lane and get hit by a car. So you freeze and you make no decision and you hit the pothole. The same thing happens when you make a call to action on your podcast. If you give somebody 14 things they can do, they don't want to make a mistake, so they'll just choose to do nothing. And you will find if you make one call to action at the end of your episode, you will have much more success getting people to engage with you with that single call to action than if you add 2 or 3 or 4. And you can rotate them. So this week you might say, hey, head over to my website and get my free download. Next week you might say, follow me on Facebook. The following week you might say, hey, if you want to be a guest on the show, reach out to me. You can rotate through them, but only use one on each episode.
I love that. Yes. Just like whenever we're writing emails or we're doing Facebook Live, anything, it's just one call to action.
Yes.
For whatever it is that you're doing. Yeah. And do you find it better to have podcasts with just one person speaking and teaching, or the interview style podcast? What do you prefer and why?
I don't think there's a right answer to that question. I personally, on Podcast Talent Coach, do a solo show where for the first 225 episodes, it has been me teaching what I know, taking my 30 years in radio and explaining to podcasters how they can use that knowledge to make their content stronger. I'm getting ready to pivot that and start talking to podcasters on how they use their podcast to grow their business. So I'll make a little pivot there, and it'll be part me teaching and part of me interviewing. So I don't really think there's a right way or a wrong way. There's benefits to both. When you do a solo show and it's just you and you're teaching and it's monologue, you can do it whenever you want. You can record your podcast at 2:30 in the morning wearing your pajamas. When a spark of inspiration hits you, you go fire up your computer and away you go. The problem with doing a solo show is you have to come up with all the content. It's just you. Good luck. When you're doing an interview podcast, you're at the mercy of your guests. You have to make sure you have guests lined up. You have to do it on their schedule. You have to be presentable. You have to be prepared. You have to do some research on the guest. On the other hand, all you have to do is field the guest some great questions, and the guest provides a lot of the content.
Mm-hmm.
So there's not nearly as much prep time for a guest as there would be for a solo show. With a co-host, it's kind of a mixture between the two. The two of you can record it whenever you want, as long as you're both available. And you can both rely on each other to come up with content, but you're going to have to create content on your own at some point.
Right.
So there's all sorts of different ways to do a podcast. It's whatever you're most comfortable with.
I love it. Thank you very much. And Erik, I know that you have a strategy that our listeners can implement in 15 minutes or less to build their business. So can you share what that is, please?
My suggestion, if you have 15 minutes a day, it's to be consistent. I run into podcasters. A lot of podcasts fade at about the 7 episode mark because it's a lot of work. And it feels like even more work when you try and do it all at one time. When I sit down and I script out an episode and I do my show prep and I hit record and I record it and then I edit it and then I have to post it and then I have to write the show notes, it's a lot of work. And if you try and sit down and do it all at one time, you're going to get burned out. So my recommendation to be more efficient and more effective is to spread that work out over the course of the week and work a little bit on it consistently each day of the week, building in some off days. So if you don't want to work on Sunday or you don't want to work on Saturday and Sunday, then figure out how much time you need Monday through Friday to create a system where you can consistently work on it each and every day and be active in it so it doesn't overwhelm you trying to get it all done in one sitting.
Good advice. And it's always about consistency.
Definitely. Even when you're on social media, if you just find that 15 minutes a day to get on social media, don't let it eat up all your time. Set a little timer on your phone so at 15 minutes the timer dings and you stop. But you're doing it every day, 15 minutes every day, and you're creating that frequency to the target. So you're being seen a lot and you're consistently every day showing up, doing the work, but it only takes 15 or 20 minutes a day. Don't get in there and spend 3 hours every day. Don't let it eat your time just surfing the internet. Be consistent with a purpose.
I love that. Be consistent with a purpose. That's a great, great, great advice. And Erik, I know that you have a wonderful gift for our listeners. So can you share a little bit about it?
You bet. I have a worksheet, a podcast talent coach worksheet. It's called 75 Ways to Drive Engagement with a Podcast. And it's 75 different ideas that you can use. Now, you're not going to use all 75 of them. You're going to find a handful that really spark some excitement within you and use those. But they're from the common sense, like use social media to drive your podcast, to the crazy, like buy a contest insurance policy and give away $1,000 or $100,000 to your listeners by creating a contest within your podcast. And I have all sorts of details within it. It's called 75 Ways to Drive Engagement with a Podcast, and it's yours for free.
It sounds absolutely great. So to our listeners, you want to head on over to bizsuccessin15.com/Erik, all lowercase ERIK, and grab your own worksheet of the 75 ways to drive engagement with a podcast. I know I'm really excited about it because if you've already got a podcast, what new and creative ways can you find to drive more engagement to it? And if you're just beginning, you have 75 ways to choose from. Love it. So, Erik, do you have any parting words for us?
If you have a podcast, that 75 Ways to Drive Engagement with a Podcast will be great to help you grow your audience. So many people want to drive engagement and grow their downloads. That worksheet, I'm sure you'll find a handful of ideas in there. If you need to launch a podcast, you can surely head over to that page that Cindy gave you. My contact information will be there. Reach out to me. I'll be more than happy to help you launch your podcast as well. I can have you up and running with a podcast in 4 weeks flat. It's really not that difficult. You just have to know which rocks to turn over to make it happen. But I truly appreciate you giving me the opportunity to share it with everybody.
Oh, it's our pleasure, definitely. Absolutely love all of the wisdom you shared with us about podcasting. And so thank you very much for being my guest today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Our pleasure. And to our listeners, you want to head on over to bizsuccessin15.com/Erik, all lowercase ERIK. So bizsuccessin15.com/Erik, and you'll find all links from today's show. You'll be able to re-listen to Erik's words of wisdom and catch up on any past episodes that you might have missed. And while you're there, be sure to grab your copy of 75 Ways to Drive Engagement with a Podcast. Be sure to tune in next week with another great guest. Big hugs and bye-byes.
You've been listening to Biz Success in 15. For all links mentioned in today's show and to watch or listen to previous episodes, visit bizsuccessin15.com. Thanks so much for listening, and be sure to tune in next week for another amazing guest.